Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. Nearly 1500 years ago, the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, although its grasp had been slipping for a long time before that. The system had enough built-in strength to continue operating even while it was rotting from the inside out, and that same characteristic mirrored the way they built their structures. By around 400 in the Christian era, Roman forces were in the process of withdrawing from their holdings in Hispania, today's Spain. By that time, the legions had been in the area in and around Segovia for nearly 500 years. That's quite a long time. They came to stay, and they built infrastructure to support and make that stay pleasant and safe. The aqueduct that you see here is a pile of closely cut and fitted stones that reaches out a hand from those bygone legionaries to today. But there's actually quite a bit more to see here in the city. Sometimes, if you're lucky as a child, you run into a teacher who changes the trajectory of your life. I was one of those lucky kids, and the teacher was my high school Latin teacher, Miss Dorothy Roby. She taught Latin and college prep English and managed to make the very dead Roman Empire come alive, at least in my mind. She's the first person who put the notion into my rather immature head that I could not just time travel using books, but in real life. I moved away from my hometown a very long time ago, but used to go back occasionally for visits. When I did, I always visited Miss Roby, even after she had sold her home and moved into a retirement community. She retained her wit, her memory, and love for learning and teaching until the day she died. Her influence on me was profound. She's gone now, except in memory, but deserves to be remembered, so I dedicate this video blog to her. Sit back, relax, and join me in exploring Segovia, perhaps as she would have, with me, the armchair traveler, as your guide. We really don't have much idea what the city looked like in the days of Imperial Rome, and I wasn't even able to find a map, although this drawing from the 1890s might give you some idea. Segovia was an important city during the Roman imperial period and went by the name of Segobriga. The word comes from two parts, Sego, which apparently meant victory, and Briga, which meant city or fortress. So the name Segobriga can be translated to victory city or triumphant fortress. It was apparently the name the local Celtic inhabitants used. When the Romans arrived, they swept it up, adopted it, and used it as their own. And it exists, slightly modified, to this day. This area was first explored and conquered by soldiers in the days of the Roman Republic, but the occupying forces hung on here long after the Republic was a memory. Roman forces generally moved into an area, conquered it, and if the prospects for long-term occupation looked favorable, fortified it and settled in for the long haul. They had a set of plans, a template of occupation that the soldiers followed, which told them what to do first. Essentially fortify the area, conquer, pacify, and generally co-opt the locals into accepting them, and then building what we'd call infrastructure to make the area attractive not just to the locals, but attractive and safe for the legionaries, who were far away from Rome with uncertain prospects for ever getting back. The plans might be modified to fit the local terrain, but as the settlement grew and attracted more people, and that was the point, there would have been two major streets intersecting at a large square called a forum. Nearby, possibly facing the forum, would be a basilica. In the days of empire, the law courts, often one of the sturdiest and most lavish of the public buildings, and so strongly built that later Christians normally converted them into churches. There would certainly have been additional roads, as well as a theater, and possibly an amphitheater or a coliseum. The large round building you see so prominently featured in this drawing today is the site of Segovia's bull ring, but originally may have been the Roman amphitheater. That amphitheater would have been used for gladiatorial games and public spectacles during the Roman occupation. Over time, as the empire declined and the Middle Ages began, the amphitheater was repurposed and most likely mined for stone. It was eventually transformed into the bull ring that still exists to this day, which was built, apparently from scratch, and most likely on the site of the original construction, in a kind of Roman-like style in 1896. Generous supplies of fresh water, in this case brought in by the aqueduct we'll visit at the end of the tour, meant there was plenty of water available for public fountains, baths, private houses, and other essential needs, including perhaps flushing away garbage and sewage. The notion was that the local people would see the very real advantages, things like sanitation, clean drinking water, and economic opportunities, and would be willing to do things in return, including paying their taxes, serving in the military, and adopting Roman customs, language, and laws over time. Before any of these things could happen, the Romans had to fortify and pacify the area and make it safe. They built infrastructure, and they built it to last. They always began with a fort or castle, a basilica, and added roads, public baths, and almost certainly a theater or an amphitheater. Sadly, almost all the original Roman construction here, with the exception of the magnificent aqueduct, has vanished. This is the castle on the site of what had previously been the Alcazar, which is a word the Spanish adopted from the Moors. The area likely would have been called Castra by the Romans. What you see today bears no resemblance to Roman construction. The fortress was built, rebuilt, extended, and remodeled extensively, apparently by each wave of conquerors, so that the earliest handiwork exists only in memory. Because the diggers haven't discovered a lot of remains, much of its history and antecedents are just educated guesses. We imagine that the Romans built a fort. When the Romans left and the Visigoths arrived, they strengthened and possibly enlarged the Roman structure. The Visigoths were pushed out by the Moors, who strengthened and left behind a few decorative elements and the name that we use, Alcazar, to this day. The Moors were pushed out by the Spanish, who greatly strengthened and remodeled the building, but kept the name. No matter who you credit with the style, the Romans do get credit for the location. The view you see of the castle taken from the parking lot is actually quite misleading. When you look at the aerial view, you can see how carefully sited the fortification was, designed to take advantage of a rocky outcrop. The ditch you see here dates from the Moorish occupation, but Roman legionaries almost certainly would have dug something similar, if perhaps not quite as deep. The building you see today is a blend of medieval, Gothic, and Renaissance influences. Philip II, the same one who married Mary Tudor of England, was a Renaissance prince. His remodeling gives us what we see now, a building extended and remodeled in Renaissance style. There are slate roofs, spires, and intricate details that were typical of the period. For most viewers, including me, at least in the beginning, it seems familiar because it was probably one of the prototypes for Walt Disney's Cinderella Castle. Segovia's cathedral is located near, but not on the same cliff as the fortress, and does not appear to be a remodeled Roman imperial era site. Archaeologists tell us there's no trace of an earlier basilica at this site, but all of that might well have been obliterated, perhaps mined and repurposed for building stone during the long time period between when the Romans left town and construction began here. The grounds in and around the cathedral today are heavily developed, likely with many layers of construction hiding underneath. Even trying to scan the area with something like ground-penetrating radar is going to take a great deal of effort, and with no real prospect of any money coming in as a result of any findings that might emerge. There's also the enormous amount of complaint they're likely to get from current landowners. What we have here in any event is a very old and distinguished building that arrived long after the Romans pulled up stakes and retreated back in the general direction of Rome. Segovia Cathedral is actually a Gothic-style building dating from the late 16th century, built at the beginning of the reign of Charles V, known here in Spain as Carlos I, on the site of a previous cathedral that was destroyed by fire. Then as now, as recently as 2019, when Notre Dame de Paris went up in smoke, or the next year when the Cathedral of Nantes did the same thing, fire is always a problem. Carlos was a Habsburg and a firm believer in display to show his power, control, and authority. Construction ran on until the final dedication, and the styles did change. It is one of the last Gothic cathedrals built in Europe in a late Gothic variant style called flamboyant, or flamboyard in France. The inside does not disappoint, as you can see from this view of the main aisle. Despite the pleasant walk, sometimes along pedestrianized safe streets, the castle, the cathedral, and many restaurants, there's no denying that the remains of the aqueduct are the main draw to the city. An aqueduct is an impressive feat of ancient engineering designed to transport water from one place, sometimes quite far off, to another. We visited what was probably the oldest part of Roman Segovia, the area around today's castle. The castle sits on a rock formation. Even the hardy Roman engineers, backed up by practically unlimited labor, could not have drilled a well here. The solution was a water infrastructure system designed to bring the water to the hilltop settlement from a spring about 11 miles away. The aqueduct channels the water and transports it to the city, but it does much more than that. The multi-level arcade that you see here is the most famous part, but much more was needed to make this system work. First, surveyors and explorers needed to find a reliable, safe, year-round water source. In this case, they found a spring near the Frio River, about 11 miles southeast of the city. They had to get the water from the spring to downtown. The water traveled through channels or conduits, more or less the equivalent of modern pipes. Sometimes those channels ran along the surface. Occasionally they were boosted up on arcades to cross gullies or depressions, and more often they were actually channeled under the ground where they would be protected. The channels were made from stone, lined with Roman concrete, and engineered to maintain a gentle grade of water flow. They were faced with Roman concrete to make them waterproof. Along the route, the water passed through settling tanks that removed sediments and impurities. Legionaries would regularly have patrolled the length of this system to make sure no one was poaching. You were supposed to pay a fee, just like today, to hook up, and that any leaks were identified and repaired. The most iconic part of the system, and the magnet for every tourist dating from antiquity to my visit, is the bridge that spans the city of Segovia, which features 2 tiers of granite arches, built sometime in the 1st or 2nd century. We don't even have a date for it. The bridge allowed the aqueduct to cross a rather deep valley here in the center of the city. In much of the city, the aqueduct ran at or below ground level. You can see where it once ran, identified with markers helpfully set into the modern road. At the end of the line, there would have been a distribution tank with outlets to fountains throughout the city. The arcade consists of granite blocks held together without any mortar. The Romans used a technique called dry masonry, which involves fitting stones together without mortar. The only way for this thing to come down would be for people to tear it down. Thank you for joining me on this visit to Segovia and a brief introduction to Roman building techniques. Segovia is our final stop here in Spain, so it's time to say adios. Next time we'll move on to the south of France, exploring more Roman-era cities that have survived to the present day. As the French would say, allons-y, which means let's go there, with me, the armchair traveler, as your guide.